Welcome to Wearing History. This is Sewing 101. Today I'm going to show you how to sew a shawl collar. A shawl collar is a collar that is cut all in one piece with a center back seam at the neck, and it has a facing. This is what the pattern piece looks like. So if you run across this is called a shawl collar. Most noticeably, you see that the rectangle comes up from the neck. That is the part that will connect to the back neck of your bodice. You'll see as we go along. The first thing you want to do is sew your shoulder seams together. In this particular pattern, this is the Laguna Wearing History pattern. The shoulder seam is gathered, so one side will be gathered to the other. It doesn't matter whether your shoulders are gathered or not. You can use this same method of attaching the collar to whatever the dress or blouse is that you're making. The critical marking parts for a shawl collar are going to be at your seam line. My seam allowance is 1/2 inch on this particular pattern, so I'm going to be making that dot where I did a little clip, line it at 1/2 inch from the cut edge, which is right there. The reason you don't want to fold it in from the seam allowance is because it will give you a weird tuck there. You want it to fit nice and smooth. So now I'm gathering my shoulder seam, which you may or may not do depending on what pattern you're particularly using. After this is gathered, I'm going to pin it to place, and then I'm going to sew my shoulder seams, but I'm going to be careful to leave it free at the dot, which is the seam line, as I showed you before. So sew from that dot all the way to the edge of the shoulder. From the dot to the edge of the shoulder. When it's done, it will look like this. This is looking at the wrong side of the back. So now these two pieces are the collar, and you are going to pin these together, and then you're going to sew it with whatever your seam allowance is. This particular pattern is 1/2 inch seam allowance. This edge will not be on the straight of grain. It will be a little bit on the bias, so you may need to ease the two pieces in together, and that's totally normal for this. So sew it with your seam allowance and then press it open. Now you can see, since I left the seam allowance open past that dot, that I have sort of a hinge there, and that's going to help you get in and sew the collar right where you need to. I'm matching center backs together now, and I'm pinning that to place. I'm also clipping my thread. And then I am easing the collar into the back neck. And because the collar is a little bit on the bias, you'll have a little bit easier time, but make sure you ease it very nicely and pin it all the way across. Right here you can see the little hinge where I did the clip in the fabric. Now pin it across, easing it in so you get no puckers and no tucks. It's very normal for one side or the other to be slightly smaller or larger. Just use the bias to your advantage and make them go nicely together. And you want to make sure that at that dot or at the seam line corner right there that it fits nice and smooth. And then sew it across with your seam allowance, which in this pattern is 1/2 inch. After it's done, it looks like this. You're going to press your seam allowance up towards the neck, and this is going to be enclosed with a collar. Turning it right side out, I can see it taking shape. This is what the shawl collar will look like. Now I'm grabbing my facing piece, and for this one I want to make sure I clip in at an angle just like I did for the outside. So my pattern has a dot with where to clip it in. Your pattern may not be marked, but you just want to clip it into where the seam line is. After this, you're going to sew the center back neck just like you did with the outer garment. I'm pinning this to place, and again, this is slightly on bias, so just ease it together really nice and smoothly, and then sew that with your seam allowance, which in my pattern is 1/2 inch. You're also going to turn under the edges of the facing piece. You may want to interface this piece depending on your pattern. Your pattern will tell you more precisely what you need to do. So I have turned under the edges here. I've finished it and pressed it open, and I've also turned up my neck edge and turned under my shoulder edge, so everything will be finished inside. Now on the 2 points there, I'm going to put right sides together with the outside garment, matching center back necks first. So I have both of those seams pressed open. I'm grabbing my pins, and I'm going to pin it right there on the seam line at center back neck. Now I'm going to match the other critical point, which is the actual point on this pattern. So I'm going to pin that, and then I'm going to pin the other side. And you can see that this has a little bit of a curve, and you just ease those two curves together. Sometimes, depending on the pattern, the facing may be slightly different shape. That just helps it to roll to one side or the other, and a lot of times they're exactly the same shape. But when cutting, things can get a little bit wiggly, so just make sure you take your time and pin them together so you get no puckers. Now I'm going to do the other side, and again I'm matching the critical point first, which is the point. And then I'm going to be easing in the two edges together so they lay nice and flush. After this is done, you're going to pin your two pieces together all the way down the front edges so that they will be finished. I'm matching my notches together and then just easing these into place. And I'm not showing the whole thing because this is quite a long jacket, so you'll just see me pin right there and just continue it all the way down. Now you're going to sew it with your seam allowance, which on mine is 1/2 of an inch. And after this, you're going to grab your scissors and you're going to trim down this seam allowance. I'm trimming mine down to about 1/4 inch. Now at the corners, you're going to clip it in like you usually would for a collar, so just clip it close to the seam allowance. And then you're going to continue clipping all the way across. So you're going to clip it down to 1/4 inch, and then it should be able to turn nicely. If not, go ahead and clip in like you normally would with a collar. After that is stitched together and clipped, now I'm going to turn it right side out, and I'm going to get my points nice with a point turner, which will be back in a second, and it will be pressed. Ta-da! This is what it looks like when it's pressed. Now we have to finish the neck edge. So you're going to turn up that seam allowance towards the inside of the collar at center back neck first. Pin this to place. Depending on your fabric, you may need to wiggle it out a little bit. See, mine's a little heavier. It's a cotton piqué, so I'm actually going to use slightly less seam allowance on the inside, and I'm just going to make sure that they fold nicely and lay right at that seam line. You're going to make sure that that little part that I just flicked with my finger is on the inside, and then your point that you clipped, this is where that comes in handy. That little hinge that you made so you can get right to the seam allowance line, that is pinning to the corner. Now you're going to ease the neck across with your pins. And again, this is slightly off grain, like a little on the bias, so you should be able to wiggle together pretty nicely. Now I'm doing my other corner. You can see my little hinge, and it's pressed there. Now I'm going to get in and pin it right there where it needs to go. And at some point, I realize that it's going to make the collar lay strangely with the gathers. So you'll see me unpin it, reposition it, and pin it back to place. That's just a good lesson that no matter how many times that you've sewn something, sometimes you need to wiggle things around a little bit to make it lay nicely. So here I'm like, wait a minute, this is kind of bulky. How am I going to fix this? Oh, I think I need to probably make the gathers face back towards the shoulder. So I'm going to unpin them and then wiggle them into place. So let me see on this side. I'm pinning it, checking it out. See how it wants to roll upwards? That's not going to work for me. So I'm going to unpin these now. I'm going to fold that up. See right there? Folding it up and then putting the gathering towards the back. Matching those two seam lines together. And I'm going to pin that to place right there. Now I'm going to do the same for the other side and see how much nicer that lays. It doesn't want to pull and roll like the other way did. So feel free to change the method if it works better for your project. That little dot there is getting matched to the clip. Make sure you have your seam allowance turned under for your facing also. So what you're going to do now, after you have positioned all this to place, is you're going to either stitch in the ditch on the machine, or slightly top stitch on the machine, or you can do this by hand, just a little whip stitch all the way across, and you're also going to sew your facing piece down, and that is pretty much it. This is it when it's finished. Looks pretty good and nice and clean. See, my shoulder gathers are there, and my points are nice, and after it's done, it looks like this. So this is a shawl collar and how to sew one. You can find my patterns on Wearing History on Etsy, also wearinghistorypatterns.com, and more fashion history on wearinghistoryblog.com. Thanks so much for watching.